As Rosa said, I want to present some work from a project that's been underway for a couple of years, and that will appear as a book from Cambridge University Press. I really hope it's this year. It may actually be next year, depending on both us and them. But it's nearly done. And before I jump in, I wanted to set everyone's expectations. My plan is to talk for a little bit less than an hour, maybe an hour. This was Rosa's invitation, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So here is where my story starts. The last 2 decades have been quite interesting with respect to collective action for a number of reasons. I think it's not too much to say that the last 2 decades have been, in some ways, transformative times for collective action. Globally, there's been a surge in protest activity, as you may know, around a number of topics, environmental issues, global justice, a war, and so on. Here on the left is an image from Copenhagen recently. On the right, by the way, is an image from Twitter. Actually, this is Twitter Fall. This is, which is an aggregator of Twitter information. These are some activists just last week continuing the conversation about what happened in Copenhagen online. Within the US, which is my focus today, these are also interesting times for collective action for a number of reasons. There's new approaches to the ways that people are being organized. People are being organized online. We have had some interesting cases in elections, particularly the Barack Obama campaign, which I think you know something about. There's lots of organizing through things like Twitter and social media. I thought I would illustrate that with 2 images. On the left here is an image of the headquarters of an organization called the National Council of Raza, which is in Washington, D.C. It's the largest advocacy organization for Latino and Latina immigrants in the United States. Works on immigration issues, civil rights, and so on. And 2 years ago, it celebrated its 40th anniversary. It was created in 1968. And this organization did a very classic and traditional thing. For its 40th anniversary, it put up a new building, and it dedicated a monument with a plaque, as people have been doing for many centuries to honor things. On the right is an image of a Facebook group on immigration, started by a high school student. This student had an assignment in an English class to write about a topic. He is Latino. He chose to write about immigration. And when he was done with his paper, he put some of the information online, some links that people could follow to contact public officials. And he's attracted about 500 people from, as best I can tell, around the world who are interested in immigration issues. So we have here very classic structures for organizing people, and we have new approaches to organizing people. In this sense, I think these are interesting times for what's happening in collective action. Now, there's been a good deal of discussion about these kinds of issues in the academy over the last few years. There's lots of cases of what people sometimes call organizationless organizing, where people engage in collective action without the presence of a traditional organization. The Facebook group would be an example of that. There are lots of people have been writing about that. Clay Shirky, Skip Lupia, I have written a little bit about that. The term horizontal politics or horizontal organizing is sometimes used to describe networks that may be social in origin and that transform themselves into political networks around particular events. The election of Barack Obama featured a lot of horizontal political organizing. This is a time of organizational fecundity. Fecundidad, I think, is the Spanish. This is a time when there's all kinds of organizations and organizational types involved in collective action. That's what makes this interesting for me. And so people are asking all kinds, I think, of very interesting and appropriate questions. For instance, under what circumstances do we need this kind of organization? Under what circumstances do we need this kind of an organization? What can you do with one of these? What can you do with one of these? And so on. What does it mean to be a member? How do people form identities with collectivities when you have these different ways of getting organized? This is the topic that interests me. I hope it interests you also at least a little bit, because that's what I'm going to talk about. And that's where this book really starts. I've been working on these kinds of issues for some time. And the book that I want to present here briefly is an effort to to frame a couple of questions that I hope make sense to you, and then try to answer them out of this big package of issues. Here's where we start. I'm actually not going to say a lot about Facebook and Twitter, because the starting point for our work is the observation that despite all of this organizational fecundity and organizationalist organizing, something is still true, and that is that organizations still matter. Formal organizations like the Raza still thrive. If you look at the number of transnational social movement organizations active in global politics, they have tripled. They tripled between 1993 and 2003. If you look at large membership-based groups in the United States, you would find that memberships are not, in this kind of organization, are not declining because of this. This is growing, and many of these organizations are growing as well. There's some exceptions in the area of civil society, but that's a little bit different story. Maybe we can talk about that later if you'd like. So many traditional kinds of actors in collective action are continuing to thrive, and we wanted to understand in this book, how are they operating? What does it mean to be a traditional organization? Or more specifically, what does it mean to be a member of a traditional organization in this environment? So if you came to hear me talk about how people organize through Facebook, I'm actually not going to do that. I wouldn't be upset if you want to leave. I'm going to talk actually more about this, which is how people organize in more traditional ways. Here's the question that I want to answer, and that is, what does organization-based collective action look like today? Given the fact that traditional organizations are still around, they still thrive, memberships are going up, there's new kinds of organizations, how does that work? And I'm going to focus on the US, and it would be great when we're done, when I'm done, if we might have a conversation together about how this might apply in Spain or elsewhere. Now, a lot of social science on collective action takes membership in an organization as an outcome. That is to say, once someone has taken the leap of joining an organization, we view that as an act of collective action, because indeed one can free ride. You can just not join Amnesty International, save your money, and let them work on your behalf. That's a case of free riding. Our question is a little bit different. We're interested in what happens once people are over the bar of joining an organization. And so we take membership-based organizations as the context for looking at collective action, not as the outcome itself. And why would you do that? Well, we take the sort of Tocquevillian observation that in the US case, most Americans belong to at least one membership organization. Actually, World Values data from 2001 show that the mean number of memberships in the US is a little under 2, 1.98. So most people are involved in some organizations already. That number is about twice the mean for Europe and about 5 times the number for Spain. So there's quite a bit more of these formal organizations in the US. That makes actually, I think, the Spanish-US comparison quite interesting. So rather than trying to explain variation in something that happens a lot, we want to say what happens after people join. So we break that down into 3 specific questions. That is, among people who belong to collective action organizations, what predicts their participation? Those of you who are quantitatively inclined will anticipate a regression model coming along here. That's how we're going to go at this. Second question is, what's the role of digital media in this? And I have a kind of subtle story there that I'll tell you about. And then lastly, I have a theoretical question, really, which is, how should we think about this variety of different kinds of organizations in an environment where there is so much flexibility, hybridity, fecundity? So how do we approach this? I have organized this talk in a very classical way. I want to take you through some theory and generate some expectations about what the answers ought to be to these questions. That is to say, give you some hypotheses. And then I'll tell you what we did in the methods, and then I'll take you through some results. So there's a little bit of theory about each of the questions, or to put it differently, what do we already know about each of these questions that might get us started? So let's start with the first question about participation. The traditional approach to explaining participation is fairly straightforward and well known. It focuses on a set of attributes that people have. The attributes contribute in a variety of ways to different kinds of participation: people's age, income, education, free time, social trust, all contribute in various ways to different kinds of participation. And there's lots of literature on that. Many of you know this literature. And this literature helps us to predict a person's general propensity to participate. But it really doesn't help us very much understanding which particular opportunities to be involved someone might seize. Or given that a person is participatory and they belong to organizations, say, because of that, the general model based on how people's education or free time really doesn't tell us which organizations they're going to be more or less involved with, and that's really what interests us. So we have looked to a different set of attributes that we call, that are attitudinal, as to say how people feel about things, that are specific to the organizations that they belong to. So our idea was that there are probably at least 3 kinds of attitudes or attributes that are specific to organizational context, to an organization they belong to, or a social movement group, or even maybe a series of events, or a political community. The first of these is goal agreement. That is to say, how much does a person perceive that the goals of the organization or the group, the collective that they're in, are in alignment with their own goals, whatever those are. Now, this is kind of an interesting problem, because in the social sciences, we all pretty much agree that many people agree that humans are driven by goals. That notion is taken to its most formal form in economics, where there's a single overriding hedonic set of goals that we assume everyone's after. But within the rest of the behavioral social sciences, we imagine that people are goal-oriented, but we really don't have much of a way of saying much about what those goals are. And our approach to this was to say that we expect that people would be more likely to be involved when they perceive that their own goals are in alignment with the organization, regardless of what those goals are. So we're agnostic about what people are trying to achieve. We want to know how much do they think that this collectivity that they're in shares similar goals. So we can survey on that without really knowing what it is exactly that they're being driven by, as people perceive goal alignment. Secondly, values. We know that values are likely to matter. So the question is, how much does a person perceive that the other people in an organization share their values, again, whatever those values are, and that the organization itself reflects their values. This is similar to goal agreement. These turn out to be correlated, but they're not the same. We imagine then that more people who are in better value agreement with their organization are more likely to be involved. Lastly is a motivational question. Motivation is obviously important to human behavior, and it's not very well studied in political science. I personally don't think that political science really understands motivation very well. Political scientists study things that are related to motivation. We study agendas and the issues that people think are important, which are related to agendas. We study interest, how much people are involved in politics, but it's difficult for us to ask very much about why it is that people, what is it that people care about and how that drives them into politics. So our approach was parallel with motivation to goal and value agreement, and that is that we wanted to know in general how people, what kind of motives bring them to their organizations, and in particular the extent to which people are motivated by being involved with others and by notions of service to the community. So this is related to the idea of social capital. If you're familiar with the literature on social capital, it posits that trust and also skills and networks drive engagement. We're saying something a little bit different. We're not interested in how much skill you have or how much trust you have. We want to know what your motivations are. Do you join an organization because you care about the community, as opposed to joining an organization because you have a complaint and you have an expressive need, you want to be heard, you want your voice out there, there's some problem you want solved, perhaps you're very much driven by goals and solving issues as opposed to being motivated by civic and social concerns. Okay, so this is a very long way of saying that we expect that when we're talking about membership-based collective action, it ought to be reasonable to ask people these kinds of questions. And we formulated this as kind of a strong expectation, which is that these attributes are actually more important predictors of collective action than the traditional variables that we use in the social sciences. So we can find out whether that's true. I'll show you the answer to that in a minute. It's not really a surprising expectation. We want to know, if we want to know about what people do in organizations, we ask them about their organizations rather than asking them about their education or their general social trust or how much free time they have. All right, let's turn to the second question. You recall the second question was, up to there, what is the role of digital media in all this? Those of you who follow the literature on digital media know that there is quite a bit of work that shows a small but persistent association between people's use of various kinds of digital media and political participation of various kinds. This has been shown mainly in the United States, but there's also work here in the PolNet group and elsewhere that shows that. The big issue is untangling causality. Rosa and I were talking about this before. There's some reason to think that there is in some case, some positive influence of digital media use on participation for some people. Now, we took, and I've done a little bit of work on this, we took a different approach because this is what worries me about this kind of research, about my own research. And that is that as internet use, digital media use becomes much more frequent and ubiquitous. It ought to explain less. When more people do something a lot of the time, there's not a lot of variance in people's use of technology, I would expect looking at that variance to be able to explain less and less over time. Now there is, I don't mean to say there's not good work to be done here. I'm doing work on this. There is some really interesting questions to be asked. But in this project, we took a different kind of approach and said, well, it may be that general internet use, how long people are online, how much skill they have, may not really actually discriminate that much. But what if we look, following the logic of what I had on the previous slide, if we look at people's use of the websites of particular organizations, we certainly ought to find a stronger association there. So if you belong to a global justice group that is protesting international trade or the WTO, certainly would make sense that you're going to spend some time with that organization's website. And if we want to know about your use of digital media and politics, we ought to look there, not count how many hours you spend online doing banking and watching television and looking at the weather. So we also stated this in a kind of strong way, which is that we expected to find that the relationship between digital media use and participation is actually stronger when you look at the specific organization's website or other digital tools rather than a general internet use. To give you a preview, this turns out to be kind of true, but not entirely true. Okay, third. The third question was, remember, how should we think about organizations in this context? This is the most involved of these three kind of pieces that I want to set up. Social scientists have traditionally made very sharp distinctions between classes of organizations. It's really important when you read the literature to know that an interest group is an interest group and a civic association is not an interest group, it's different. Particularly if you follow the literature on social capital by Robert Putnam and others, it's really important that civic associations are really different than interest groups. In the work on organizations themselves, in the business literature, the economics literature, the sociology of organizations literature, distinctions are made in all kinds of ways about centralized and decentralized organizations, between networks and organizations, and so on. In many ways, when people look at organizations and collective action, they almost always start by differentiating what kind of organization they're interested in. This literature is, I think, a mess. There's lots of theoretical silos that they don't really talk much to one another. I have contributed to this mess myself, so I'm guilty about that. In this present work, we're trying to see if we can make this a little bit less messy. And the argument that I want to make to you is that in a lot of this discussion about how do we think about organizations, what's an interest group, what's a civic association, you might ask what's a party, so on, that there are basically two big issues that are at stake. This doesn't describe the whole landscape, but there are two issues that are commonly at issue in this literature. And The first of these is in a collectivity, whether it's a social movement organization or an interest group or a civic association or a network or a bank for that matter, one thing that matters is people's interaction with one another and whether it is personal or impersonal, or how personal or impersonal it is. That is to say, how much contact do you have in an organizational context with others that you know? Fundamental issue in the work on civil society, the work on interest groups, and so on. The second issue at stake is how people in a collective action environment engage with the goals of the organization itself. That is to say, do individual members have an opportunity to shape the goals and the activities of the organization, or are they recipients of requests to do things? So in a classic interest group, what does it mean to be a member of an interest group? You sit at home and you receive requests in the mail to do things, to write a check, sign a petition. You have no engagement with the goals of the organization, where the organization is deciding to spend its energy or resources. That is decided elsewhere. We think of that as institutional engagement. You are, in our terms, in an institutional kind of environment if you are being asked to do things without any opportunity to shape where the organization is going. We just use the term entrepreneurial to describe environments where individuals have a chance to shape what the organization is doing. Now, let me see if I can illustrate that and make this make more sense. We have arrayed these two dimensions orthogonally, perpendicularly. So if you think about interaction as a horizontal axis, and you imagine that we can plot people's, in any particular environment, their participation in a protest movement, say the run-up to the Copenhagen protests or WTO protests, or their involvement in an election campaign or some other environment, we can plot how much they have personal interaction with others that they know, and we can plot them their location on this scale. If we place the other dimension vertically, that is the engagement dimension, we get a two-dimensional space. And if you want to read some trigonometry, we go through some gymnastics. I'm not going to show you today. To actually measure the angle between these empirically, you can do that. It's not very hard. So this creates a space, in any case. We number the quadrants in a Cartesian way, starting up there with 1 and going around the corner, going around the circle. So the idea then is that if we were looking at the members of any organization and we ask about how much their engagement is institutional or entrepreneurial or personal interaction or impersonal, we ought to find, first of all, a distribution, because not everybody in every organization does the same thing. The big mistake in classic approaches to imagine that everybody in a civic association is civic and equally so. It's not true. So we ought to find that any organization would occupy some kind of footprint. And let me just illustrate some. This is not empirical. This is kind of heuristic. World Wildlife Fund. World Wildlife Fund is an international environmental organization. I'm using their logo here without permission. The World Wildlife Fund does not offer very many opportunities for people to become engaged with its setting the direction of what it does, nor does it offer opportunities for people really to interact much with one another. Now, that is changing because of technology. That's a big part of the story. But classically, the World Wildlife Fund is a fairly institutional and impersonal organization. It has members. The power of what it does comes from the fact that its members give money and lend their clout and their name to its activities. You could imagine another organization, a community group, in some locale that organizes either over time or maybe just on an ad hoc basis to solve some local problem, right? To work on services from the city or solve a crime problem or to get a park built or what have you. The people in that kind of organization have a lot of personal interaction. They're likely to know one another. Some of them are likely to be really well known, and others may know fewer people, so there's a bit of a distribution on the axis. And obviously, people in that kind of organization have lots of opportunities for shaping what it does and where it goes, although not all are equally involved. So there's some kind of footprint. You can think of other organizations. I mentioned Amnesty International earlier. I don't know exactly what shape Amnesty International's membership is, but Amnesty International is a federated international organization, as you know, and not only does it run a national agenda, but it provides a variety of ways for people to get involved in projects that matter to them with other people they know. So I would guess that if we surveyed people in Amnesty, we would find that some have a pretty personal experience with others and some entrepreneurial opportunities, and others find themselves basically just in a big anonymous membership group. They give money and that's it, they read a newsletter. You could keep going, we could argue about this. I would invite you to dispute this. I would put Greenpeace here. Greenpeace in some ways is like Amnesty. I don't know if it has a bigger or smaller footprint, but it has opportunities for people to have personal interaction. Many people belong to it, on the other hand, in a very impersonal way. Okay, so the point is not right here to worry about exactly what these look like, but the point is that we can talk a little bit about organizations without worrying about how they're classified. To talk about organizations this way is to set aside what their observable objective structure is, and instead to say, what is the experience of people in the organization and how does that vary? Right? What's the experience of people actually in Greenpeace or in a community group, and how does that vary? We, to just go on this a little bit more, this study that I'm presenting here is not longitudinal. We have no overtime data. But we imagine that digital media are creating some tendency for organizations' footprints to spread out, particularly along the horizontal axis. Many organizations that we talk to informally, indeed, are trying to use social media, like Twitter or Facebook, to draw people in and to allow them to engage with one another in a social way, to bring social interaction, personal interaction into the organization. Most organizations that I've talked to don't really have any idea how to make that work right, but they're trying to do it. They're trying to create opportunities for this to happen. You see this in big interest groups that historically have been incredibly anonymous. They interact only by direct mail. They're setting up chat rooms inside. They're creating social media to try to get their otherwise anonymous members interacting with one another. So that creates some pressure along the horizontal axis for organizations to spread out. The technology also permits some spreading along the vertical axis. Most organizations don't like that at all. They like to stay where they are. If you're an institutional organization, you control your agenda and you want your members to do what you say. You don't really want them getting involved in your agenda and shaping things. Other organizations really like that. So there are some tensions within organizations. But the idea is that we can use this to think about over time change. You can use this to think about hybrid organizations, organizations that have more than one kind of feature. You can think historically with this. One of the big historical stories in the United States is that during the 19th and early 20th centuries, a lot of US civic engagement was located in the left-hand side of this chart in quadrant 2 and 3. There were lots of civic associations that involved people personally. Even political parties in the US in the 19th century had a very local component, often workplace-based, strongly rooted in patronage, with lots of opportunities for people in localities to get together with one another. And over time, the story, at least one of the stories about civic association in the US is a decay of participation in the left-hand side of this, and the growth of different kinds of more anonymous association on the right. The growth of the US interest group system, which is very highly articulated, is really a story about more people becoming engaged this way in collective action as opposed to over on the other side. Okay, so let's see. How does this all come together? This collective action space is a way for us to think about the memberships of different kinds of organizations and ask questions about them, generate some kinds of expectations like I've just done. We, as a kind of empirical claim, something to test, we expect that across different kinds of organizations that there really is basically a lot of within-group variation. And if you look in any one organization, you actually are going to find that people are spread out. Not everyone's civic, as I said. A civic organization, even in an interest group today, which would an erstwhile anonymous organization, there are people who are engaged with one another. And the last hypothesis here actually is the most interesting, and to me anyway, and maybe the most subtle, and that is that we expect the answers to the previous two hypotheses or questions to be different by quadrant. It seems to us that if you are, say, in the upper left here, which is to say you are personally involved in an entrepreneurial way. We would imagine that motivation and values and goals in technology work differently for you than if you were in the lower right-hand quadrant. You're in an institutional kind of relationship, an anonymous relationship. And so we wanted to see how the answers to our questions might vary, and this around collective action space. And this is a really kind of exploratory. We didn't really have any specific expectations about what this would look like, except that it would probably not be the case that one model would work equally well everywhere. Okay. Is everyone with me so far? That's a lot on what we expected to find. I will say kind of briefly where we got some data. We chose 3 organizations on a most different kind of set of considerations. One is the American Legion. The American Legion is a classic American civic association. It has about 3 million members. It's big. Its members are all veterans of military service who served during time of war. So this is a membership of people who share a very powerful experience. Whether you like that experience or not, service in wartime in the military is an incredibly tightly bonding experience. And the American Legion is dedicated to these kind of veterans, and it has a very strong physical infrastructure. It has buildings and communities all over the United States where veterans get together, they have barbecues, they sponsor charitable events, they get involved in local politics, they get involved in national politics. This is just classic civic association in the US. The second, and they tend to be quite conservative politically, for obvious reasons. Second organization, I'm calling the People's Lobby. This is a pseudonym. They are a large, anonymous, membership-based interest group. They have more than 1 million members. They're also big. They are direct mail-based. They're a classic interest group. Their politics tend to be more moderate. 15 years ago, if you belonged to this organization, the only thing you ever saw from them was glossy items arriving in the mail. They are a direct mail-based organization. They're the epitome of that kind of organizing. That's no longer true. If you belong to that organization now, you can go online, you can meet other people who belong to that, you can post videos, you can talk about issues. The organization is a little different than it was. That organization, we plan to reveal the name of that organization when the book comes out. They asked us, as did the last organization, not to use their names until we are done. They are going to basically see whether we have embarrassed them. And if we haven't embarrassed them, we will be able to use their names. And if we have embarrassed them, we will not, and they will stay hidden like this. That was the deal, basically. We're actually in negotiations with them right now, taking the manuscript next month to the People's Lobby to talk about the final paperwork to reveal who they are. The voters, I'll describe them. They are an online-only group. They're also quite large. They are a liberal interest group. They interact with people entirely online. They have no building. Unlike Raza, you can't go to the voters. They have buildings with servers in them, but there is no street address. They are networks of people who operate out of their homes. They rent mainly home offices. They rent an office space for a couple of people, but there is no headquarters. And we are also in negotiations with them, but we don't go see them. We just talk to them online because there's nobody really to go see. What we did is obtain from each of these groups membership lists so that we could conduct probability samples. We got email lists and also phone lists, and we surveyed both ways. We have both email and phone surveys. The ends are very different. I'll tell you why that is. If you're interested in sampling, I'll tell you. I can talk to you about that. So to get at these questions, here's what we ask people basically in the survey. We ask people about their participation in what the group does via a bunch of things. Do they write letters, volunteer with the organization, donate money? That is to say, do they do collective action inside the organization? We also asked about a variable that's new, I think, to the study of collective action, and that is identification. Organizational identification is a concept that's fairly well validated in the literature on organizational theory. it taps how much a person feels identified with an organization, and it's usually used to study employees of organizations. And the key kind of theoretical thing that makes this interesting is that the theory of organizational identification holds that as people become identified with a group, they take on the goals of the group as their own. As to say, they identify with the group's objectives. So there's this indicates an influence of the group on the goals of the person. We, for the most part in political science, really think about the problem the other way around. People have their goals and they find organizations that might help them pursue those goals. Or they free ride in the hopes that their goals will be met in some other way. Identification asks us what happens to the person over time, and do they have a relationship and a kind of identity relationship with the organization. We have a whole bunch of independent variables, which I'll show you in a minute. Some demographics. We asked a lot about, in other ways, how involved people are in their communities, how much they express themselves politically. I'll show you that in a minute. We have scales for measuring interaction and engagement, which allows us to construct the quadrants and so on. And the values and goals and motivation I talked about, and some technology stuff. So that's what this is going to look like. Now, let's see. Okay, so I want to show just a few regression results right now. I realize not everyone does regression. If you don't, if this is not how you think, just bear with me, and we'll have some conclusions that kind of summarize this. Basically, we wanted to predict people's participation in the goals of the organization. This is the internal collective action measure that we're really interested in. And we ran a series of models adding variables to try to look at those questions. Remember, the first question was that what are the variables that predict this, and what happens when we add technology, for instance. What you see in the blue here, the light blue on the left, is a baseline kind of model. We're looking at people's age and their education, and we looked at how participatory they are in general, how much they express opinions by writing to newspapers or calling radio shows. We looked at how much they contact officials. We asked whether they belong to community organizations. That's a social capital measure. Whether they go to community meetings to solve problems, even outside of an organizational context. And we ask about social trust. And what we find is that these things tell us almost nothing about who participates and who doesn't inside these three organizations. You just can't learn very much this way. And the reason that this is probably true is that the people who belong to these organizations are already selected to be pretty participatory. That was sort of our problem to begin with. We're interested in variation among people who are engaged, not trying to figure out who's engaged in the first place. Now, in the second model here, we added a measure for what quadrant people are in. The quadrant is just derived from where they fall in collective action space on engagement and interaction. We used the midpoint of our scale for that. Turns out not to really matter exactly how you do that. And what you find, if you look here, is that the quadrants 1, 2, and 3, compared to quadrant 4 was the reference category, being in any of those quadrants makes one considerably more participatory, particularly if you're in the upper left. If you're engaged entrepreneurially and personally, you're considerably more likely to be involved in your organization than if you were in the bottom right-hand quadrant. And we're not able to explain a lot here, but the R-squared does double. It's not bad. So quadrant tells us something. The next step, we put in variables for the actual organizations themselves to see if it mattered that you know which organization people belong to. The answer there is that it really doesn't. You don't learn, knowing this much stuff, what quadrant they're in and the above variables, knowing which organization the person is in tells us nothing. And the last block of variables then are those that I described to you: values, goals, motivation, and so on. And what you see there is that there's a lot going on. Values and goals and motivation matter. Motivation, that civic and social motivation variable matters greatly. We used a measure of internet skill from Katz and Rice. This is, we just ask people how skilled they are. That conflates people's perceptions of their skill or their confidence with their actual skill, but that doesn't really matter for us. Internet skill is significant. We ask people how long they're online, at work, off work, doesn't matter. And we ask whether they visited the org's website or went to a chat room and, associated with the organization and so on. And you find that that is significant. And we're actually able to explain a fair amount that R squared of 0.39 is not bad. So we can say quite a bit if we get at these specific questions about what people are doing in their organizations. Really, I think that's not a big surprise. But it helps us kind of focus our further questions. I have another table here that looks at identification, which was that second dependent variable. I don't want to go through that in a lot of detail in the interest of time, but I will just kind of flash it up here. What you find when you look at people's identification with their organization is that, again, what quadrant you're in matters. And again, quadrant 2 is special. If you are involved personally and in an entrepreneurial way, it's really different than being involved impersonally and institutionally. No great surprise. And we find that the technology variables don't matter for identification, actually. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. So we find some support for those first two expectations. This is sort of a rough answer begins to evolve here about those first two questions. Recall the third set of questions, question instead of hypotheses, and that is about the variation within groups and how these models might differ by quadrant. That's where we're going. This chart plots the actual footprints of the three organizations. They're obviously a lot less neat looking than the ovals that I drew for Amnesty and Greenpeace and so on. And they're tilted on an axis in 3 dimensions. But you see the three organizations here, and with a number of cases on the vertical axis. And I'll say a few things about this. First of all, the American Legion Civic Association does indeed have the most personal interaction. But the thing that's really interesting is that, for me anyway, is that in the People's Lobby, this anonymous interest group, and this online group, between 1/3 and 40% of the people in the interest group and the online group have more personal interaction than the median person in the Civic Association. In other words, there's just a lot of personal stuff going on in interest groups and in this online group, and there's a lot of fairly impersonal stuff going on in the Civic Association. And so this suggests to us further that these old categories just aren't terribly helpful. We're not really able to say what this would have looked like 10 years ago. I would love to have been able to do this, but I can't. But I can say right now that if you want to know what's interesting about these organizations, you need to do a lot more than just ask what kind of organization it is. You need to see what people are doing inside the organizations. Our next step then, the last step really, is to combine these folks across the groups and to plot them in the 4 quadrants. To divide them into their 4 quadrants, and then to run these models and ask our questions about what predicts participation in each of the quadrants. So the question here is, if you're in quadrant 1, how are you different than people in quadrant 3, say, on the story that I have just told? That's the question. Does the story vary around the quadrants? And rather than give all of these regressions, I have just taken out the significant variables so you can get a look at those. And we're going to start up here in quadrant 1. Remember, this is impersonal interaction and entrepreneurial engagement. The question is, what predicts people's participation in their organization, whatever the organization is? These are people in all 3 organizations who fall up there. And what you find is that a variety of things predict people's participation. I won't go through this in detail. People's contacting officials, their age, whether they use the technology, internet skill, and so on. That first variable at the top, which is labeled COM, INTEG, is the motivation variable, civic and social motivation. We call these people, we're looking for names for these people, and we have some names now. If you have ideas for better names, I'd like to hear them. We call the people in quadrant 1 individualists because of what we find for their interaction and their, which is impersonal, and the way they're involved with their organization. In addition to what we're showing in the model, we ask people some other questions, like whether they have friends who belong. People in the upper right don't tend to have friends who are also involved. We ask whether they report that contacts they've made in the organization are useful elsewhere in their life. This is a key kind of notion behind the theory of social capital. People in quadrant 1 say no. They don't have friends in the organization doesn't really do anything for them aside from just what it does. There's a lot of things that influence people's participation, but we can't explain a whole lot, really. The R squared is pretty small. It's the smallest of all of these. So these people are kind of subtle and complex. They're hard to predict. There's a lot going on for them, basically. Now I'm going to compare all of these. These are, in quadrant 3, you have a very different story. These people are very simple. We can explain a lot of what they do. This R squared is really high. And there's only 2 variables that matter, motivation and visiting the website. This is really kind of a striking thing. And by the way, these histograms are not comparable across quadrants. These are different models. And you'll notice that these bars, the lengths are different in each quadrant to show that. They're just each normed basically to whichever is the most significant, or the strongest variable. We call these folks traditionalists. They tend to have friends who belong, unlike the people in the upper right. And they also tend to report that their contacts in the organization have been useful to them somewhere else. So these are really kind of classic social capital types. They're simple, really simple. They are very participatory. It's easy to predict their participation. And they take something out of the organization. And the people who fall in quadrant 3 look like this. We call them embeddeds. That's kind of a bad term. Please give us a better term. We call them embedded because they are embedded in personal networks, because they are involved with the organization itself. They tend to have friends who belong. Like the traditionalists, they also value the contacts that they get from the organization. They have the highest level of identification. You don't see that here, but I'm just telling you that. They also have the highest level of trust in the organization. So these people are sort of really kind of archetypally good citizens, basically. The people who report that their interaction is impersonal and their engagement is institutional down here in the lower right, we call instrumentalists. Not also a great term, but it's kind of the best we can get at right now. They are the least likely to have friends who are involved. They have the lowest identification with the organization. They have the lowest level of trust in the organization. These, to us, look actually like the most like classic rational actors of anyone in the group. We didn't really measure kinds of things that you'd need to measure if you wanted to get at that. But these folks are not very trusting. They're not very identified. They are involved in some other kinds of activities that carry over into what they do here in their organization. Okay, let's see. I think that I'm going to wrap up now. I want to summarize a few of the things I've just gone through. These 4 quadrants seem to us to tell us something that we didn't know before about organizations. At least it does to Cynthia and Andrew and me. And we find that there are actually some reasonably distinct empirical profiles, particularly between the upper right and the lower left quadrants. And in some ways, this is probably, I think the data don't quite support this, but we're really tempted to think about how at least some of the quadrants seem to evoke different theoretical approaches to explaining participation. People in the upper right seem to behave in some ways most like traditional behavioral models of participation, where people's involvement in other community affairs carries over, some demographics matter. It seems to us that people in the lower left in some ways look most like the theory of social capital. The people in the lower right seem a little bit more instrumental, more kind of in line with economic models of behavior. We're really struck by the fact that this motivation index, which is comprised of 3 questions, is the most important predictor. We're not entirely sure what to make of that. It's possible that these motivations are what drive people's development of social capital and their participation. I can't be sure that that's true, but these are the kinds of motivations that go with social trust and being involved in organizations. And it could be that when people who study social capital find people who are trusting and who have networks are also more participatory, it might be that motivation is driving both participation and what people do in their civic environments. I'm not sure. I'd like to know a lot more about that. We were interested to find that only in the case of individualists can you tell anything about what people are doing in their organization by looking at what they do outside their organization. There's a kind of ecological mistake you can make if you assume, at least among these kind of people, if you assume that people who are involved in their communities, who express opinions, who have a lot of interest in politics, are also going to be involved in every organization they're in. That's not the case. At least it's not the case for everybody. I haven't said a whole lot about technology use here, except that in the case of visiting organizations' websites, this is consistently appearing in our models across all of the organization types. There's big endogeneity problems here because, as Raza will tell you, it's almost certainly true that people who are more inclined to be involved are going to go to the website because they want to be involved. It may also be that people who might not otherwise be involved find it easy to do that and learn new things or are mobilized through social networks to become more involved. We don't know which way the arrows go, probably goes both ways, but we certainly see, regardless of who you are, that there's something going on with the technology. Regardless of who you are with respect to the quadrants. The other thing that's really a big theme and also caveat in everything I say here is that all of this work looks at people's attitudes with respect to just these three organizations. I can't say anything about these people's involvement with other organizations or what the members of other organizations would look like. But we certainly can say that for these organizations, people's technology use matters more when it's tied to the organization rather than in general kinds of terms. So what that would mean that if I wanted to go out and study other cases of collective action, in addition to just looking at the generic measures of how much people are online or how much they use social networking sites, I would want to ask people about how much they're involved with a particular cause or an event online, rather than only focusing on the technology. So trying to bring the content of the technology together with the technology use. Okay, so this is last slide. Trying to step back a little bit more and give you a kind of summary. The question you will recall at the beginning was, what does organization-based collective action look like in the United States? And I think the answer is something like this. It looks different for different people as a function of interaction and engagement, not a function of the things we traditionally think of, at least not for the most part. And that what matters about organizations is indeed these things, how they facilitate people's engagement, how they facilitate people's organization, not just what class they belong to. So an even larger kind of claim that's probably even less, I'm less able to support empirically, but maybe it's something to talk about, is that one of the things that I come away from the study with is the notion that people are less similar than we sometimes think they are when we use single models to explain whole populations. While organizations, on the other hand, are a lot more similar than we have tended to think. So there's, I think, more heterogeneity among humans and the types and the profiles and styles of participation, and there's a lot less heterogeneity among organizations than we might have imagined. So that's where this wraps up. So I'm going to stop there, and we can maybe open this up for a conversation.